a lot of these blood samples before the science became possible to do the things they're now doing. So by gathering it and keeping it for 20 years, they can call back, they can go back to the older blood samples if they have new research techniques available.
By doing this, they've been able to identify genetic variations associated with many kinds of cancers, and they're now even able to estimate how long you have left to live based on levels of particular proteins in your blood.
The other fun thing about coming out of this temperature into normal temperature is what happens on cold glass. Condensation, lots and lots of condensation. And it doesn't stop forming. So that's it. Camera's written off for about an hour now.
And a bit later, once we've dried off and warmed up, I am going to blow your mind with a discovery researchers here have made that links your body shape to the way your mind works. In the meantime, in the US, James Clayton has been uncovering a different way in which ancestry data and DNA is now being combined to solve murders.
The suburbs of Fort Worth in Texas are quiet, sleepy.
East to west.
I'm here to visit the brother of Carla Walker, a teenager who was abducted and brutally murdered in 1974, over 4 decades ago.
I have memories, especially of Carla, sitting out here talking to girlfriends. She and my sister Cindy shared this large room on the 2nd floor.
And that's where she lived when she was abducted?
That is correct, yeah.
Her younger brother Jim remembers the day clearly.
Carla had her pretty dress on and Rodney was looking quite nice in a suit. And we took pictures in front of the fireplace and off they went. We searched for the 3 days. We searched and searched, hundreds and hundreds of law enforcement, probably near 1,000 volunteers were searching everywhere. And I remember a news reporter coming to the house and saying, well, Mr. Walker, what are your feelings now that they found your daughter dead? That was the first we heard about it. Carla was severely beaten in the face, brutally raped, and she was choked to death.
For over 40 years, Carla's case remained unsolved, one of an estimated 200,000 cold case murders in the US. Murders that up until now, we thought would never be solved.
We had a lot of really wonderful detectives working on it, trying to move it forward, but 4 decades, 44 years before it really got moving again.
The breakthrough came not in Carla's case, but in a case in 2018 on the west coast of America. A stunning investigation that threatens to revolutionize cold case murders across America using ancestry websites.
The Golden State Killer wore a ski mask.
The Golden State Killer was a serial murderer and rapist that terrorized California in the late 70s and early 80s. The police had plenty of DNA of the killer, however it didn't match to any DNA profiles in the FBI's database. One enterprising officer decided to run the DNA found at the murder scenes against DNA collected by an ancestry website. These sites are usually designed for people to find genetic relatives through DNA links, but the police realized that if they put the killer's DNA into the database, they might be able to find the murderer's relatives, a crucial clue. Most ancestry websites don't allow law enforcement checks, but a few do. The website the police chose to use was a company called GEDmatch.
So effectively what they're doing is building family trees. So you have to build back far enough till you reach what they call a most recent common ancestor, and then figure out where the trees came together and then build forward from there. So by doing that, you're able to zero in on who the potential suspect is.
The capture of the Golden State Killer was a proof of concept moment. The technique worked. So could it be used to solve Carla's case?
You want to find hits that are within third cousins to make the case tractable. So we definitely had some that were within the third cousin range.
Othram was founded shortly after the Golden State Killer was identified, with a mission to solve unsolvable cases. The company's CEO, David Mittelman, says the first step in the process is to clean up the DNA, which is often degraded. In Carla's case, it was more than 40 years old. The company then sequences that DNA, looking at thousands of distinctive markers on the genome.
And in the traditional forensic DNA testing framework, like for CODIS, there's about 20 of these positions in the DNA that you're measuring. And that information can be used to confirm that you were at a crime scene or that someone closely related to you as a sibling, parent, or child was at a crime scene. And that's the extent of what you can do with 20 markers. What we do at Othram is we look at tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of markers. And with that information, we can detect more distant relationships.
Every time you test for DNA, you lose a bit of the sample in the process. In Carla's case, there was little of the killer's DNA left. It was likely this was the last roll of the dice.
We had to ask ourselves, have we seen enough DNA that is of this kind of quality and property to where we feel confident that there's a good chance we'll have a positive outcome? Otherwise, we don't want to do it because when you test DNA, you're consuming it, and so you're destroying evidence.
Once they'd sequenced the killer's DNA, they ran it through several genealogy websites. From there, they created a family tree of the killer. And then began to look for possible suspects, the right age, male, who lived in Texas at the time of the murder. They developed a theory that the DNA found at the scene belonged to a man called Glenn McGurley, a man who lived close to Carla, a man who had previously been a suspect.
I know that he had had to drive up and down the road in front of his house thousands of times, probably had even stopped here. They knew who it was, but they had to do their due diligence as law enforcement to confirm. And that's what they did. And about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call. We know exactly who it is. We're going to be arresting him.
Last month, McGurley pleaded guilty to the murder of Carla Walker. Some people, however, simply don't believe that ethically this technique should be used, worried that opening up people's DNA to law enforcement, people who aren't known criminals, could have worrying consequences.
Genetics isn't just any old tool for law enforcement. It's a particular and a potent tool because it's not like a phone number that you just change when you get too many spam calls, or even a social security number that you might have reissued if somebody, takes yours. It's a technology that's in its infancy. We don't know yet what it will tell us, how well it will tell us things about people.
The big criticism of this technology is around consent. So after I get my DNA tested, I can go onto GEDmatch and I can upload my raw DNA files to the website. But here's the problem with that. I share DNA with my relatives, and critics argue that once I've uploaded my DNA and agreed to law enforcement checks, I am by association also opting in my entire extended family. And using my DNA, the police can link hundreds, perhaps even thousands of my genetic relatives to a crime, potentially none of whom have consented to be on a database used by the police.
I think the thing about people have to make the mind up in, you have two competing priorities here. The first priority is you have an absolute right to privacy. But on the same token, you have a competing priority, which is we have a right to not get murdered and raped. What amount of privacy are you willing to give up versus getting, the increased safety in society?
We hear about serial rape, we hear about serial murders, but less prominent are going to be cases that there might be more controversy about, whether it's using it in an immigration context or using it in a less serious crime context. We structured our society with suspicion-based reasons to intrude on people's privacy because we felt as a community that that was the right thing to do, even when it means that occasionally some crimes go unsolved. I think it is incredibly hard to say this. I don't mean to minimize or be dismissive of the claim, but we don't make policies about the civil liberties of our whole society based on the personal feelings of single victims or the needs of single victims.
After the apprehension arrest was made, I started to feel peace, P-E-A-C-E. You know, I didn't realize for almost 4.5 decades I had been geared up for a fight. We're not going to go away. We're going to find you. We're not going away. And thank God that day came.
Hello, it's time for your weekly tech news roundup. It was the week Google claimed it's Bing's most popular search term while appealing against antitrust fines from the European Union. YouTube is now removing videos containing vaccine misinformation for all currently approved vaccines, not just COVID-19. And California has passed a new law to stop workers being fired if they are not meeting productivity targets set by algorithms. It's had ears for a long time. Now it has eyes. It's Amazon's new robot, Astro. The family-themed robot can be controlled remotely and features a periscope to see in high places. However, some critics have raised privacy concerns. Facebook has delayed releasing a version of Instagram for children after parents and experts raised safety concerns. This comes as recent research has increasingly shown how use of social media can affect the mental health of young people, with many under 13s already using Instagram. And finally, as China announces a complete ban on cryptocurrency, one hamster is busy raking in profits from its cage. Mr. Gox is currently outperforming the S&P 500, with a portfolio up by nearly 24% since June. The German rodent's crypto-rigged office lets him perform exercises that execute trades. Gives a whole new meaning to wheeling and dealing.
We've seen the power DNA can have in solving crime and the ethical dilemmas around that. Yet many are willing to give up a little saliva to get to know themselves better. DNA Nudge assesses customers' propensity for certain conditions, guiding them away from the foods that would also increase their risk.
If you've got the genes for hypertension, then salt is something you should be careful of. If you've got the genes for type 2 diabetes, saturated fat and sugar are your problem. So what we do is we relate those conditions or those genetic risks to those macronutrients in food.
Time to hand over my DNA, which I've been assured will be destroyed straight after it's been analysed.
And then we load that into the cartridge, and then we load the cartridge into one of the nudge boxes.
It looks like a coffee machine.
An hour later, I have my results.
It looks like I really shouldn't be having salt or much saturated fat. Danger from fat, medium. Calories, medium. These aren't actually the results that I expected. Chris, I'm glad you're to hand.
Obviously, you don't have the obesity risk, but saturated fat and salt are indicators much more of cardiovascular. So obviously, these are things that you can't see on the surface.
My data's then loaded onto a pod that can be worn to help track my exercise and shape my shopping habits.
You can scan the food to see if you could eat them. Okay, I shouldn't have that. I can also try it on here, which are also salted peanuts, but it says that it's fine to have. 0.39 grams per serving there, 0.6 grams per serving in that, so it's almost double as much salt. Well, I wouldn't have expected that. Here you've got the same brand of peanut butter, and just changing from one to the other could apparently save you this much saturated fat over the course of the year, although of course this does all depend on how much you're consuming. So obviously lifestyle does have a big effect on this. What's the percentage balance then, do you think, between DNA and lifestyle?
I would say it's roughly 30-70. DNA is around 30, lifestyle is around 70.
DNA Nudge is not the only company in the DNA nutrition and fitness space, and many post kits home. Neda Garani tried one after reacting to dairy and bread.
Once I did the the test, I saw that I am actually lactose intolerant, which made sense. And also I am at a slight increased risk for celiac disease. Just that knowledge that there is an increased risk for me really helped me, push me to that step of reducing the amount of wheat that I eat.
But Neda, who's also a research scientist, raised red flags about simplified genetic reports.
It's understandable for the general population, but maybe someone who doesn't really understand genetics may take the results as being having a greater effect than they actually do.
I took the test myself as well, but the diet recommendations contradicted those of DNA Nudge. So, a little confused, I took a trip to a nutrition genetics lab.
What do you keep in the fridge?
It's full of saliva.
It is full of saliva.
Dr. Yanis Mavramatis specialises in nutrition genomics here, and instead of offering me a coffee, decided to test my genes as to whether I should have one or not.
You can deposit your sample and just return it back to me.
It takes longer than you would think to fill a container with saliva. I've only got to get it up to there. It's done.
The problem is not this part. We can do this part quite well. The challenge is to find an area that is meaningful, and we have a lot of science behind it. So there is no consensus as to which DNA areas we need to analyze. So company A may have their own genes that they believe are the most important ones, and company B may have a different set of genes. We need to be able to communicate possibilities and probabilities to the public, and that's not always an easy thing to do.
Even when scientists do agree on genes and their impact, more data is needed for a full picture.
Genetics can actually be quite meaningful if you combine it with other parameters of the person, their individual dietary intake, lifestyle, physical activity, sleep patterns and whatnot. If you just use genetics, it's not going to work.
But whilst our DNA can't offer every answer, at least Dr. Yanis later confirmed that I'm free to drink coffee, whilst I mull over my need for any diet change. Or not.
I tell you, she'd never have given it up anyway. Now, back at Decode Genetics in Iceland, founder Kari Stephenson has been looking at a similar and possibly controversial topic: how our genes shape our bodies, our minds, and our personalities.
I can tell you how we can use genetics to explore in a way the nature of man.
His most recent scientific paper has been looking at how that relates to one of the developed world's biggest health problems.
If there is one condition that predisposes to more diseases than anything else, it is obesity. Obesity predisposes to heart failure, to liver diseases, to osteoarthritis, to type 2 diabetes. It predisposes to an incredible number of all cancer diseases.
Now, some people are genetically predisposed to become obese. Their genetic makeup means that they're just more likely to overeat. Not all of these people do become obese, it's just more likely. And of the people who don't have those genes, well, some of those will also become obese for other reasons. So Decode set about trying to answer the question, which is it that makes these diseases more likely? Is it obesity itself, or is it the genetic tendency for obesity? And it turns out that you are not simply cursed by your genes to get ill.
And that genetic tendency has no impact on these diseases. So it is purely the obesity itself that predisposes to the disease. And then we ask the question, what is it then that this genetic tendency has an impact on? Which part of our biology, which part of our being is being influenced by this genetic score for obesity? And indeed we showed that the greater your genetic tendency to become obese is, the worse you perform on all kinds of tests of cognitive function. Your verbal IQ is less, your performance IQ is less, your trail-making test is worse, your education is less. Obesity itself has no impact on cognitive function, so you don't become stupid by becoming obese. But the genetic aberration that makes you lose control of eating behavior has an impact on many other functions of your brain.
So obesity makes you susceptible to other diseases regardless of your genes. But the gene which makes obesity more likely does affect your intelligence. The researchers then looked at the data from the other direction and asked, does your personality, and specifically your ability to solve problems, tell you anything about how your physical body might develop? And here they found that the better your visual and spatial ability, the more likely you are to have the genetic tendency for obesity and all those obesity-related diseases. You're also less likely to be curious and creative, but also less likely to suffer from psychiatric conditions like schizophrenia. However, if you score higher on verbal ability, you'll have less risk of obesity and related diseases. You are more likely to be curious and creative, but also you'll have a greater risk of schizophrenia.
And what fascinates me about this is that the way in which you are genetically hardwired to solve problems has an impact on the composition of your body.
Just give me a minute. I'm working it out for myself at the moment. I hope we all are. I know where I am on that, or at least I think. Oh my God.
Wow, amazing the secrets that our bodies can hold. And that's it for this week's show. As ever, you can keep up with the team throughout the week on social media. Find us on YouTube, Instagram, Facebook and Twitter.
Hello, certainly won't be a washout of a weekend, but a fairly soggy afternoon on the way for the vast majority. Rain at times, heaviest across some southern areas, but we will see the strongest of the winds confined to parts of the south and the east. Gales expected here. Tomorrow looking much brighter, mixture of sunshine and showers. By this stage though, the strongest of the winds in the very far north of Scotland. Today's strong winds are the eastern edge of this developing low pressure system. That's going to scoot its way up to be in northern Scotland by tomorrow. But underneath it, as we've seen, various weather fronts combine. Plenty of rain around to take us through the afternoon. Dry start though across parts of eastern England, good part of Scotland, and drying up across parts of Northern Ireland after this morning's rain. A scattering of showers here though through the afternoon. Turning wetter central southern Scotland, maybe some parts of northeast England, southeast Scotland won't see the rain until late in the afternoon. Driest of all, far north of Scotland throughout today. A cool day, 11 to 15. Some lively showers, but a bit of sunshine in between into Wales and the southwest later. Winds lighter here than this morning, but the strongest of the winds this afternoon are along these southern coastal counties of England, right the way through into East Anglia. 40 to 60 mile an hour gusts, accompanied by heavy rain, some very unpleasant travelling conditions. Now through this evening and overnight, strong winds, heavy rain across eastern areas to begin with. The strong winds remain in parts of Scotland as our area of low pressure works its way northwards. Elsewhere, we'll see some clearer skies, a scattering of showers in the west, and a bit of a fresh start to Sunday morning. Temperatures down into single figures for the vast majority. So the chart for Sunday shows that our low pressure will be centred by this stage, and it's around that we're going to see the strongest of the winds. But we're bringing in, again, fairly cool air mass coming in from the north and the west, with a mixture of sunshine and showers for the vast majority. Driest conditions to begin with, eastern areas. Some will stay dry all day long, although 1 or 2 showers possible into the afternoon as a breeze picks up here. Strongest of the winds in the far north of Scotland, especially Shetland. We could see winds close to 60, maybe 70 miles an hour at times. And again, it will feel cool in the breeze, offset a little bit though, once you've got those longer, sunnier spells. And we will have some sunshine in London for the marathon. It's almost perfect running conditions, I think, for many. A few showers potentially later in the day as the breeze picks up. Much showery, though, for the Belfast Marathon, of course, which is also taking place. And then as we go through the rest of the week, be prepared for some more wet and windy weather potentially on Tuesday. Things turn drier and a little bit warmer, we think, later in the week. Bye for now.
Fellow Americans, the war in Afghanistan is now over.
Tonight, we saw the images of the last American soldiers face to face with the elite guards of the Taliban transferring control.
It is this whole city in normally pretty peaceful southwest of England that is hurting so much tonight.
In practice, tubes like this will continue to be used, but routine monitoring will be put on hold.
The BBC News Channel, more than just the headlines.
Hello, good afternoon. The group, which represents most of the UK filling stations, has said the availability of fuel in London, the South East and parts of eastern England is getting worse. However, the Petrol Retailers Association had said Scotland, the north of England and parts of the Midlands had seen a distinct improvement. The government has announced that 100 military drivers will begin delivering fuel to petrol stations from Monday. Here's our business correspondent, Katie Austin.
There were queues for fuel again this morning in parts of southern England.
This is the first time I'm queuing up because my boy normally gets it for me. But today, oh my gosh.
The organisation, which represents independent forecourts, says the supply picture has improved in the Midlands, the north of England and into Scotland.
No problems at all. I've just put £100 in the van to keep us going for the week.
Well, a few days ago it was very hard, but I think it's starting to pick up a little bit now, you know.
But there's a warning the situation appears to be worsening in London and the South East.
We've been asking government, and I've had a long conversation with Grant Shapps this morning. It's very good. Government are talking closely to industry about the problems. And what I've asked him is that the prioritisation, all deliveries must now go to London and the South East and to the independent forecourts, which make up 65% of all forecourts across the UK.
200 military personnel have been called in to help with deliveries. 100 of them are drivers. They're currently training before the first cohort start properly on Monday.
The first big amount will be really working through this weekend, deploying in Monday, probably on their own more, and then by the end of the week another 60, 70 will come online.
This comes amid a chronic shortage of HGV drivers across the economy. Last weekend, visas were announced for 5,000 to come in from overseas, lasting until Christmas Eve. That includes 300 fuel tanker drivers. Now we know they will be able to start immediately, and the length of time they can stay in the UK has been extended to the end of March. 4,700 of the visas are for food lorry drivers. They won't be able to start until later this month, but the length of their stay has also been extended until up to the end of February. The government still says visas are only a short-term fix and businesses must invest in building the domestic workforce. Ministers insist the fuel situation will continue to improve if people buy only what they need. But even when supply levels return to normal, motorists are being told they should expect to pay more at the pump as wholesale prices rise. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Well, our political correspondent Nick Eardley is in Manchester, where Conservatives are gathering for their party conference, which opens tomorrow. Nick, has the government, or at least does the government think it has finally got this under control?
Well, that's the hope, Sean, that the situation is continuing to stabilise, that there's much better fuel supply and that maybe not immediately, but over the medium term, this will start to get better. It's interesting, though, because we've also heard those warnings about what's going on in the south of England, and warnings like that have forced the government to make some decisions it didn't really want to make, like sending in the army to help from next week, like adding those extra 300 emergency visas to its plan over the next few weeks. Boris Johnson's been repeating this morning in the newspapers that he wants to make the HGV driver situation a lot better by getting more people from the UK into better paid jobs. That's going to be one of the themes at the Conservative conference when it kicks off on Sunday. But there's an interesting backdrop of the fuel supply issues, other issues in the supply chain, energy, lots of things for Conservatives to think about, some of it making some Tory MPs quite nervous.
Nick Eardley in Manchester, thank you. Vaccine passports came into effect for the first time in Scotland on Friday night. People need proof of vaccination to gain entry to nightclubs or to large events. The scheme the enforcement of the scheme will become mandatory from the 18th of October. It's being trialled at some football stadiums at Scottish Premiership matches this afternoon. Megan Patterson has more.
A night out in Glasgow. As well as showing ID on the door, vaccine passports too.
I do think some people will definitely be driven to get vaccinated in order to be able to participate in this kind of event.
It's definitely incentive, but my main reason is to be protected fully, obviously.
I don't agree with the whole concept of having to show something to get into a club. I don't agree with that in terms of freedom.
proof of 2 doses of vaccine. It'll be shown before people over 18 enter nightclubs and any event with more than 10,000 people in attendance. For some club owners, there's concern about what it means for customers.
It's a little bit disappointing, even though myself I'm double vaccinated, that there isn't an option for people who don't want to get vaccinated. We're not sort of respecting their opinions by being able to submit a negative lateral flow and then still being able to go to a nightclub. We're saying effectively, don't come.
At football grounds including Ibrox, today will be the first test of the COVID passport scheme at matches. The app's been plagued with technical problems in its first few days, and although it went live yesterday, it won't be enforceable until the 18th of October, causing confusion for clubs. Aberdeen have postponed the trialling of proof of vaccine for entry at Sunday's Scottish Premiership meeting with Celtic, and Hearts and Rangers say no one will be refused entry for failing to produce a vaccine certificate at their test events against Motherwell and Hibs. With access to the terraces, dance floors and elsewhere soon to be reliant on the vaccine passport, the Scottish Government's issued reassurances about the app's capacity, saying systems have been improved to better cope with demand. Megan Patterson, BBC News.
The Queen was addressing MSPs in Holyrood this morning to mark the opening of the 6th session of the Scottish Parliament. This will be the SNP's 4th consecutive term in government following their election win in May. Alexandra Mackenzie reports.
The Queen and the Duke and Duchess of Rothesay made the short journey from the palace of Holyrood House to the Scottish Parliament. They were greeted by the party leaders, including the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. MSPs gathered as the mace and the crown of Scotland were placed in the chamber, symbolising this new session of Parliament.
Marking this new session does indeed bring a sense of beginning and renewal. The Scottish Parliament has been at the heart of Scotland's response to the pandemic, with people across this country looking to you for leadership and stewardship, and I hope you will remain at the forefront as we move towards a phase of recovery.
Due to the pandemic, much of the music was recorded around the country, like here in Plockton. And this group of asylum-seeking and refugee musicians in Glasgow.
Those of us who sit in this chamber will disagree, often and often very vigorously. But in the years ahead, we will also, I hope, find the resolve, indeed the courage, to reach beyond our disagreements and find consensus and common purpose where we can.
The Queen also used her speech to reflect on happy memories of the many times she spent in Scotland with her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. She said this was a time to look to the future and a new generation. Alexandra Mackenzie, BBC News.
Sport now, and at the BBC Sports Centre, it's Gavin Ramjan. Good afternoon to you, Gavin.
Yes, hi there, Sean. Nice to see you. The winners of the early kick-off in the Premier League will go to the top of the table for a few hours at least. It's Manchester United against Everton, and it is still goalless. United have had the best chance so far. Cristiano Ronaldo has started a league match at Old Trafford from the bench for the first time in 14 years. 0-0 there. Britain's Cameron Norrie has enjoyed another impressive win. He's into the semi-finals of the San Diego Open after dropping just 4 games. Beating 4th seed Denis Shapovalov. Norrie's brilliant form of 2021 has stalled in recent weeks, but this victory took him into his 6th ATP semi-final of the year, where he'll face the top seed Andrei Rublev. And the London Marathon returns tomorrow with thousands of runners on the streets of the capital. Last year's event was limited to just elite athletes because of the pandemic, and many were forced to take part virtually. Mike Bushell has been speaking to some of those who've been preparing for the race.
It's finally back, the world-famous marathon that gets 40,000 people running together, all with individual stories and reasons why they're pounding the streets of London. Among the most emotional, Claire Nash and Wayne Flanagan, running in memory of their daughter Jade, who died in January this year, just 10 days after she was born. Both Claire and Wayne had tested positive for COVID-19 just days before Jade suffered unforeseen complications during her birth.
Immediately after Jade died, I started running as a way to kind of start start to understand like my grief and the loss of Jade, and the emotions, and just felt so overwhelmed quite often. So as I started running more and more, I just realised like the benefits for me, my mental health and my well-being. So we are running it to raise awareness and funds for the people that cared for us and Jade during the time, so NHS and care workers.
There's going to be lots of tears and lots of smiles. We know that we're going to have a lot of friends cheering us on, so it'll be really special to see them. And I think the thing that's going to help push me through is obviously knowing that Jade's there, but hearing everybody shout her name as well. That's going to be really, really special.
Last year, over 37,000 people did run the marathon virtually on their own, wherever they could, joining in spirit and via their screens. And even though a similar number are signed up to do it again virtually this year, there's nothing like the real thing.
I truly believe that this is going to be one of the most emotional and memorable London marathons in the history of an event that's had some pretty special moments.
Whatever the reason or personal cause, the 40,000 runners tomorrow will once again have the love of the running community around them and the crowds helping them all the way to the finish line. Mike Bushell, BBC News.
Yeah, it will be great to see the crowds back. That is all the sport from us for now, Sean.
Gavin, thank you very much. The next news on BBC One is at 5:10. Until then, from all of us, have a good afternoon. And welcome back. You're watching the BBC News Channel with me, Sean Lay. Now, let's get more on the fuel supply crisis. The Petrol Retailers Association says there's been an improvement in the availability of petrol and diesel in Scotland, the north of England and parts of the Midlands, but supply issues remain a big problem in London, the south east and eastern England. Retailers are now asking Transport Secretary Grant Shapps to prioritise deliveries in those areas. 300 foreign fuel tanker drivers will now be allowed to work in the UK until the end of March to help ease the situation. Earlier, I spoke to Brian Maddison. He's from the Petrol Retailers Association, and he described the situation out on the roads.
We're seeing from our poll this morning much the same as yesterday, an improving situation from the Midlands through the north and into Scotland, but in fact a worsening situation in London, south east and parts of East England. So what we've been asking our government, and I've had a long conversation with Grant Shapps this morning. It's very good. Government are talking closely to industry about the problems. And what I've asked him is that the prioritisation for deliveries must now go to London and the South East and to the independent forecourts, which make up 65% of all forecourts across the UK. If your local filling station doesn't have fuel, and then you travel further and find yet more filling stations without fuel, then consumer confidence is going to remain at the low end.
So go local first.
Absolutely. Do the local filling stations, the neighbourhood filling stations, the transient filling stations that people pass and see, and they can tell whether it's dry or not. And if they're starting to get fuel in, starting to work normally, then consumer confidence will return quite quickly.
Are you clear why the government didn't begin this training of military drivers earlier? Because there was a long period where they were saying initially, obviously, there was a crisis. Then they acknowledged they might put them on standby. Then they did put them on standby. It seems to have been kind of, and meanwhile, days have been going past. Because presumably, had they done that, the deliveries could have started sooner. Or if they'd found they weren't necessary, they could have just stood them down.
Yes, the driver training has been taking place over some years previously. And it's really just getting sure that the vehicles are roadworthy for busy motorways, city centres, that the drivers are absolutely prepared for this. So really, it was short-term contingency work needed to make sure, as the Secretary of State has said, you're driving 42,000 litres highly inflammable fuel in some of the most crowded road conditions possible, particularly in London and the South East. So they've got to be absolutely up to the game, and I'm sure when they come out this weekend, they will be fit for purpose.
The other kind of bad news that drivers may be about to face is an increase in the cost of fuel at the pumps.
Yes, that is, I'm afraid, the next shock. This week, we've seen wholesale prices go up by as much as 3 pence a litre. So next week, when the new stock does start arriving at the fuel stations, the retailers have got no alternative but to put the prices up. We can see pump price creep by up to 3 pence a litre next week. This is definitely not profiteering or gouging. This is purely a result of global factors.